This video lesson will cover Chapter 1 in your textbook, looking at people, politics, and participation. This chapter serves as an introduction to government, and some of the topics we'll be going into more depth with. This chapter will focus on the role of government in citizens' lives. We'll take a look at what shapes ideological perspectives. We'll also look at the origins of American democracy. And lastly, we'll be looking at American political culture and how values are connected to social and demographic groups in the United States. First, let's cover some basics. What is government? Governments are institutions that create order. They're responsible for carrying out policies and laws, and they help citizens understand how they are to abide by those laws. Citizens serve as members within that government, and they enjoy the rights, privileges, and responsibilities that are attached to being a member of that government. In the United States, individuals are born into citizenship, but they can also be naturalized. Immigrants go through the process of naturalization. This means that they are issued green cards in which they typically wait for 5 years within a grace period before they can become naturalized citizens. Governments are important because they serve several functions. One, they protect the sovereign territory of their citizenry, and they also provide national defense. This allows for governments to preserve order and maintain stability. They're able to do this foundationally through legitimacy, and this is where governments are given legitimacy or granted legitimacy by citizens who recognize that the policies that are created under that government ought to be respected. The legitimacy that is recognized by citizens among government is very important in establishing and maintaining a legal system. In addition to security and maintaining order, we can also look at a government as necessary in providing public goods. Now, there are private goods and public goods. When we talk about private goods, we're looking at the private sector or the market. When we look at public goods, we're looking at services that are provided by the government, whether that be services or even products. There are many goods or services that societies believe or governments believe should only be administered by the government as opposed to the private sector. This is because a government recognizes that certain types of goods and services should not be limited and should be available to all. There are some services and public goods that are considered better allocated by the government. Some of these services would include access to education, food subsidies, being protected by police departments, fire departments, subsidized housing, and even healthcare. And although healthcare is still highly debated in the United States as being necessary for the government to administer, is not seen as controversial in other developed countries. As in every other developed country, healthcare is provided as a basic right to citizens. Governments also serve an important role in trying to stabilize an economy. They will raise and spend money, often through taxation, funding certain projects that they think may create stimulus and generate growth. Another key function of government is to socialize new generations, and this is often done in education systems as early as primary education. We know that this is true because when you hear certain terms like freedom, democracy, patriotism, or equality, we know that that means something to us all. Now, we disagree as to what extent that can be expressed or exercised or honored, but fundamentally, we believe in those things. Now, there are different types of governments that exist in the world. We can first look at monarchies, and there are two different types of monarchies. There are pure monarchies, in which a government of a royal family, usually a king or queen, has absolute authority over a territory and its government. A constitutional monarchy, on the other hand, is a monarch that plays a ceremonial role but has little say in governance. Typically, constitutional monarchies are separate from parliament that actually makes policies and laws. An oligarchy is a government in which an elite few hold power. Often this can be associated with a dictatorship. Although there may be a distinct figurehead that often is seen as a dictator, they're typically advised by a group of people that happen to be in power. And lastly, for democracy, that's a government in which the supreme power of governance lies in the hands of its citizens. So again, this brings us back to legitimacy. We're going to talk a little bit about social contract, but this idea that power is only derived by the legitimacy of the citizenry. An example of a democracy would be a republic, and that's the kind of democracy we have here in the United States. The US does not have a direct democracy. If it were a direct democracy, all citizens would vote on every policy that was implemented. Instead, we vote in representatives that we trust to ensure that the policies are created are looking after us. All we can do is hope that we vote in representatives that represent our views. You will often hear the United States described as a democratic republic. We can also classify governments, and a classification of governments may include totalitarianism, which is a system of government in which the government essentially controls every aspect of people's lives. An example that's used in the textbook is the Kim regime of North Korea. Authoritarianism is a system of government in which the government holds strong powers but is still checked by some forces. So even though there may be a recognition of a strong dictator or leader in power, or a strong oligarchy, there still is some level of governance in which citizens still maintain some power. So an example of this would be Russia's government. Lastly, we have constitutionalism, and this is a government that's structured by law, in which the power of government is limited. So when we look at constitutions, we see that, especially with the US Constitution, there's so many parts of it that are built in to ensure that individual liberties are protected. Some of the strongest examples to invoke when talking about limited government would include First Amendment rights. So when we look at those rights, we're really talking about liberties, but these include freedom of speech, freedom of religion, the freedom to assemble, the freedom to petition the government, and freedom of the press. Next, we'll be talking about the origins of American democracy. This should be a recap of much of what you've learned in U.S. history. We can see that the seeds of democracy began when monarchies were challenged in Europe. The monarch's claims reflected the political theory of the divine right of kings. This assumes that monarchies have some connection to God and are able to carry out God's will. This led to a challenge of monarchies as well as a Protestant Reformation, where Martin Luther challenged the Catholic Church, leading to the questioning of the crown as well, as they were both connected. This led Protestants or Puritans to flee to America to establish self-governing colonies. Before these Puritans, also referred to as Pilgrims, reached the shore in 1620, they drew up what is known as the Mayflower Compact. This is an example of social contract. The Mayflower Compact served as an agreement between people and their leaders so that people could agree to give up some of their liberties so that other liberties would be protected. The Enlightenment period also served as a great foundation to American democracy. We can look to Sir Isaac Newton, for example, who was an important Enlightenment scientist and theorist, who discussed the idea of natural law. Newton's work in physics, astronomy, math, and mechanics demonstrated the power of science and refuted ideas based on magic and superstition. Newton's ideas about natural law, or the assertion that the laws that govern human behavior are derived from the nature of humans themselves, can be applied universally. Thomas Hobbes, who was a philosopher known for the Leviathan, was very much in favor of absolute monarchies. This can be argued because the strong naturally prey on the weak, and through social contracts, meaning that contracts that are delegated between monarchies and citizens that can relinquish rights for protection. And without an absolute monarchy of some sort and a social contract, there would be anarchy and violence. So Hobbes believed that monarchies were the most productive way or the most feasible way of instilling a government with stability and order. That brings us to philosopher John Locke, who was known for forming social contract that was more reliant on the concept of popular sovereignty. This is the theory that government is created by the people and depends on the people for the authority to rule. Locke, as opposed to Hobbes, rejected the rationale of divine right and also paved way for more radical notions on the rights of individuals and the role of government. Locke is who would be seen as inspiring the Declaration of Independence written by Jefferson and really foundationally homes in on natural rights, including life, liberty, and property. Essentially, through a social contract, the government can protect natural rights. And if the government fails to protect natural rights, then the people have the right to rebel. Locke's ideals and theories can be taken a step further with Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who emphasized popular sovereignty, which is the theory that government is created by the people and depends on the people for authority to rule. This is influenced by social contract theory, which is the idea that individuals possess free will and every individual is equally endowed with the God-given right of self-determination and the ability to consent to be governed. These ideals also helped frame the Declaration of Independence as well. So all of the Enlightenment thinkers that we discussed earlier helped shape the democratic republic that was established here in the United States. And with that, we can see a political culture that has evolved. And this political culture reflects our collective beliefs and attitudes about government and the political process. So when we hear terms like liberty, equality, our appreciation for capitalism, the consent of governed, and individualism, these are all key principles or components of what has created the political culture that we understand today. Now, it's important to note that although these are principles that we all stand by, we disagree very much so on how and to what extent they are respected in the United States. So first, let's talk about equality. We can understand our concept of equality as taken from the Declaration of Independence, this idea that all men are created equal, or all people are created equal. Now, this was inspired by the idea that everyone is equal in God's eyes. Many will argue, however, that in the United States, there are many groups that don't necessarily enjoy that sense of equality. So this might include people of the LGBTQ plus community, African Americans, Muslim Americans, and then also by means of wealth disparity, so looking at different social classes on the basis of economic wealth. Capitalism is the type of economic system that we run on here in the United States. You can interchange that with free enterprise or free market system, but it's an economic system in which the means of producing wealth are privately owned and operated to produce profits. So rather than being run by the public sector or the government, it's run through the private sector. Now, this does come with government regulation in the United States. Some socialist elements also exist in our society. So remember, the allocation of things that are considered kind of basic needs that everybody should have the rights to might be publicly administered. And then also when it comes to property, right? That's a huge cultural pillar in the United States as well. The fact that people have the right to own stuff, land, even intellectual property. So again, all key elements. In the last part of this lesson, we're going to be talking about political ideology and these terms that are used to often discuss political ideology. So liberalism is essentially the ideology that advocates change in social, political, and economic realms to better protect the well-being of individuals and to produce equality within society. Now, it's important to note that there was a major shift in what it meant to be liberal. So classic liberalism is actually very much connected to limited government authority, and the government not infiltrating the economy. This shifts, however, with FDR after the New Deal was implemented, and this is where the concept of liberalism or the idea surrounding liberalism starts to shift. So now you've got a larger governmental role in guaranteeing equality, including the involvement of economic affairs and creating safety nets. So looking at Social Security, looking at welfare, looking at unemployment. Those are just some examples to name a few.